when you compare the New Testament manuscripts to the average Greco-Roman manuscript, classical text in Greek or in Latin, what you're comparing is a huge difference in the number of manuscripts and the date of the manuscripts. The average Greco-Roman author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence today. 20 copies. And that's really actually a very high estimate. Most of them have 2 or 3, 4 or 5, something like that. But I typically use the number 20 when I debate skeptics on these things, and they've never disputed it. The New Testament, by comparison, has almost 6,000 copies of the New Testament in Greek alone. And we're comparing apples with apples. We're talking about the copies in any language, and these, the average Greek author has less than 20 copies. We've got almost 6,000 in Greek alone, plus 10,000 plus in Latin, as well as other ancient languages, Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Armenian, all sorts of languages. And those are another 15 or 20,000. So we've got somewhere between 20 and 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament that are handwritten manuscripts before the time of the printing press. And you compare that to 20 manuscripts of the classical author. That means we've got, on average, more than 1,000 times more manuscripts for the New Testament than the average classical author has. That's just stunning.
Wow.
You stack them up, that classical text would be about 4 feet high. The New Testament manuscripts would be, my best estimates are it would be over 6,600 feet high, so well over a mile high, about a mile and a quarter high of manuscripts.
Wow.
And now, in terms of the date of the manuscripts, you're waiting at least half a millennium, over 500 years, before you get any manuscripts for most classical authors. 500 years before we get our earliest ones. For the New Testament, we're waiting decades. Decades, not centuries, not half a millennium, but maybe 2 or 3 decades, maybe 4 decades. Our earliest New Testament manuscript that's been published so far is called P52. It's a small fragment of John's Gospel, discovered in 1934, and it's about the size of a credit card. But this particular manuscript sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames. In 1844, 90 years before it was published, a German scholar did some fancy philosophical argumentation to say that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and he felt it was closer to AD 170. Well, that held sway for most of European scholarship for the next 90 years. At least that John's Gospel must be a 2nd century document. Whether it's quite that late, they weren't sure. But that also meant, therefore, it's not historically reliable because there's nothing of any eyewitness value in this. And then 90 years later, 1934, a fellow by the name of C.H. Roberts discovers this small fragment from John's Gospel, and he was a newly minted Ph.D. He had just earned his doctorate, and he sent photographs of that manuscript to the 3 leading papyrologists or papyrus scholars in Europe. Each one wrote back to him independently and said, this manuscript should not be dated any later than AD 150 and probably closer to AD 100. All 3 of them said that. A 4th demurred, and he said, no, I think maybe it should be dated as early as the 90s. Well, today, most scholars would say John's Gospel was written in the 90s. And so if you have a copy of John's Gospel written in the 90s, then it's, first-generation copy. It's incredible. But regardless, the fact is that here you have a copy of John's Gospel that is earlier than the date that this European scholar had 90 years earlier than this said that's when the original was dated. So he argues, AD 170, if a copy is made in 150, it's kind of hard to have the original come 20 years later, Mm-hmm. So this is the kind of a thing that we're looking at, and these kinds of stories get duplicated over and over again. We have as many as a dozen New Testament manuscripts, all fragmentary, from the 2nd century, from between AD 100 and 200. By the time we get to 500, we've got well over 100 manuscripts, the New Testament duplicated many times over, and yet, you compare that to the average classical text, we've got nothing.